reality is not what you think it is. This is kind of an illusion. We think we're looking at the world. That's a huge, colossal, crazy era of naive realism. What must be going on algorithmically in the brain, shockingly, it ends up with this core nugget of truth. It conforms to exactly the way that meditators hundreds of years ago were describing, deconstructing their phenomenology. We don't wake up out of the dream, we wake up within the dream.
Dr. Shamil Chandaria is a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Oxford's Centre for Eudaimonia and Human Flourishing and at London University's Institute of Philosophy, focusing on neuroscience and well-being, a Research Fellow at the Imperial College in the Neuroscience of Psychedelics, and a Bi-Fellow at Cambridge University. His multi-disciplinary interests also extend to computational neuroscience and artificial intelligence. He is currently working on computational theories of consciousness and meditation, having been a meditator for 38 years, with training in early Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, Advaita Vedanta, and Kashmiri Shivaism. In this discussion, we go into his journey into spirituality and his current project, which highlights the many ways in which cutting-edge research in neuroscience of perception not only validates the phenomenology of spiritual awakening, but in fact provides a new map with which to navigate it. I also ask him about his upcoming talk and course in London on this topic, which we hope to make available online also, and all the links are in the description below.
I started meditating very consciously, actually, like just after university. Because I guess in my final year at Cambridge, I read several books like the Tao Te Ching, and I realized, oh my gosh, everything I've been doing is like upside down, less is more. So I kind of, like freaked out everyone in my final term where I would just like work for a few hours a day and then just relax. Because this is the kind of message that I was getting from the Tao Te Ching at the time. And yeah, actually it went really well. Good advice.
Oh.
But, but then I spent the summer holidays kind of going through various traditions and deciding how to approach this journey very consciously. And I ended up learning Transcendental meditation, TM, which was kind of a big thing back then, in the late 80s. And it was actually a very good and powerful introduction to meditation. And I've basically been meditating since then for almost 4 decades and going on retreats for every year for those years. And it was, it's I think I would very much recommend anyone to start early and have a daily practice. I think this is basically the take-home message. After all the science and all the spirituality and all the philosophy, in the end, my message is going to be, remember to meditate every day. Yeah, so I started spirituality back then. And then I was always interested in how the brain works. And fundamentally, I saw all these different spiritual traditions, and it didn't make sense to me that they were saying something ostensibly different. I was much more always a kind of perennial philosophy kind of person, where I thought there was just uh, a unique approach, but different traditions were giving different perspectives of this unique message. And I think that, yeah, I mean, uh, that meant that I was looking for kind of an understanding which chimed with these various different traditions, but also with science. I mean, after all, the best language of our modern world is science, and science has achieved so much. I mean, we've got iPhones and we've sent people to the moon, and it seems to be very effective. Um, and yet, uh, you know, we've had this difficulty of resolving these deep human impulses towards spirituality and how the brain works. And that fundamental cognitive dissonance has been, I think, problematic for the modern mind. Um, and I think that, in fact, we can make bridges between science and spirituality. So, yeah.
And what were you studying at Cambridge at the time?
Oh, I was like natural sciences and then mathematical economics, so very technical and mathematical,
Uh-huh.
which actually, I'm really grateful for because it set me on this path of having a kind of very detailed oriented view and understanding that like at the deepest levels, when you really understand something very deeply, like physics, it ends up in this kind of mysterious place as well, where we don't know what particles are, and we don't know what stuff is made of. What we have is the mathematics, but what is mathematics? Where is it? If even if there wasn't a universe, would there be mathematics?
And so just to go back to that initial question of, you'd said you'd recognize the importance of spirituality. Is it okay to ask a really big question, like what is spirituality for you? What's important about it from your perspective, either what you recognized at the time or how that's evolved?
Yeah. Well, I think it's about awakening to the nature of our mind, to the nature of existence, and the nature of what we take to be our lives and our experience. Um, Fundamentally, it's about the existential position of human beings, of any experiencer. Um, and that existential situation, um, we we take it pre-theoretically, just intuitively, to be that we are this experiencing subject somehow thrown into the world, and like we're seeing people and tables and chairs and phenomena. And yet, we're also part of the universe. And so, in another sense, the universe has multiple uh, perspectives, subjective experiencing viewpoints. And how do we put this together? Yeah. So spirituality is an exploration of this kind of material, in another way of putting it, how to resolve the finite, our finite beings, and the infinite, that infinite potential, which is the source of all different manifestation.
I think I saw Eckhart Tolle paraphrasing the Bhagavad Gita, and I'm going to say what I remember him saying. I might misrepresent what he said, and who knows if he exactly quoted the Bhagavad Gita. So it's um, a few steps removed from the source. But it was something like people arrive at spirituality for one of three reasons. Um, One is suffering. People are suffering and they're looking for a way out. One, I think, was love. They just love God, or they have this deep devotion that they feel a need to express. And the third, I think, was just a deep curiosity. Like, what is this? What is going on? Um, and that's the one I'm hearing most from you today. I'm sure at other times you might feel the other two come forward, but yeah, it creates an obvious link to science. The fact that the core driver that you've um, spoken of just now was this curiosity of like, well, it seems like I'm this organism that's looking at existence and there's objects and there's things out there and I'm in here. Correct me if I'm misrepresenting what you said in some way. Yet, obviously, I'm also part of existence and so is everyone else. So it's existence looking at itself. And it's this,
Yeah.
and then it would make perfect sense that the first person or contemplative approach to addressing that question would be equally interesting as the third person, scientific, more objective approach. Have I captured a little bit
Yeah,
of what you've said? Is that relevant?
you've actually captured what I've said perfectly. But actually, uh, I'm telling you this almost from the perspective of today. And now that you say about suffering, it is absolutely also the case that I came to spirituality because, as a uh, teenager, I was unhappy, actually. Um, Suddenly, at the age of, I don't know, 8 or 9, something happened and I became unhappy. And it was this kind of deep unhappiness. Um, and so, suffering, the suffering part, I think was deeply important. I now look back at that and say, well, that kind of suffering was the momentum to get the spiritual path going. And I think that's always been the way. That was Buddha's basic amazing marketing. But it's also Nietzsche's. Um, you know, Nietzsche actually wished difficulties upon his friends. And that wasn't because he was a nasty guy. It was actually because he realized that out of difficulties, we sublimate and grow. And so I think, yeah, that suffering element is actually really important. And in a sense um, um, was sort of captured in this existential situation that we find ourselves in. Um, the infinite has no lack. It is perfect and, um, in a sense, at peace or perhaps joyous. But our finite beings, um, are beings that are naturally disposed to um, wanting certain things and not wanting other things. And that's the kind of fundamental Faustian bargain of finiteness, which leads to suffering.
Hmm. And if it's okay to ask, we can you can ignore this question or sideline it if you prefer. Did something particular happen when you were 8, or did it just kind of arise, this discontent?
No, it's interesting. I think it just, arose.
Huh.
I, I kind of, uh, suddenly life was heavy and unsatisfactory.
Hmm.
Yeah. So it was very interesting. Uh, and and I think that that dissatisfaction is actually a very important motivator.
And did it motivate you at the time in a spiritual direction, or did that happen later?
I mean, it was
If I
a
think back to when I was 8, I'd be unhappy sometimes, but I would assume if I got a better He-Man toy or, you know, was friends with the cooler kids or something,
yeah. I mean, I guess you know when I was 9, then I went to boarding school. Then there was a lot of suffering
Mm,
because English boarding schools in the early 1970s were pretty tough places.
mm.
Um, so there was just a lot of suffering. Um, I think uh, by my teenage years, I was actively looking, trying to understand some self-help material and whatever. And so there was this period of searching um, until I went to university and started reading Hermann Hesse, and then there was this actually amazing book, which actually, in a way, um, uh, really spoke to me and continues to define this kind of science meets spirituality trajectory of my life, which was the Tao of Physics, the Tao of Physics, which was actually my first real introduction, even though I have an Indian heritage, my first real introduction into Eastern spirituality and then modern science and how there could be parallels.
So there wasn't a big spiritual emphasis in your household growing up.
Actually, there was, and I'm really grateful in a sense because my mother meditated from when I was growing up, and so there was this general thing that yeah, meditation was a thing. She actually, even though she of course has the Indian heritage as well, she also learned TM, which comes out of that's mantra meditation coming from non-dual Vedanta tradition, Advaita Vedanta. But it's very systematized. And so she used to meditate. And so it was kind of normalized for me.
Mm.
Uh, and I guess I'm really grateful because she basically says, all you have to do is meditate. So somehow I took that seriously.
And do you want to say a little about what the goal or the importance of meditation is from your perspective? And I'd love to know if it changed. Maybe you had a different view of it when you started, and that's evolved now, so you can answer in both ways if you want.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think meditation is a familiarization with the nature of mind and consciousness and being. Um, and there, so that's sort of the sort of big picture. Of course, there are many different types of meditation, which I'm very grateful that because I've been able to meditate in different traditions. I've been exposed to all these different kind of techniques, and one of the great things about Buddhism is that explicitly there are um, shamatha techniques which calm and quieten the mind so that we can be exposed to these deeper levels of awareness and ultimately of pure awareness. There are deconstructive techniques so that we start to deconstruct and investigate the phenomena that arise within us, thoughts. You start to deconstruct thoughts and say, this is just a thought arising rather than actually being in the grip of the thought. Or we can investigate emotions and notice that these emotions are, they feel really real, But as we investigate them, we notice that they're just made of sensations and thoughts and smoke and mirrors. Um, and so this is very helpful because we start to see that these phenomena that arise are impermanent and they're not really us. They're not what we are. They're just something that's arising. And we see that these phenomena cause dissatisfaction, unhappiness, or they're things that we really want and we can't get them, or they're things that we don't want normally. And so they're the source of suffering. And so we start to investigate this and we start to see that actually all these phenomena that are arising are essentially mental constructions. They're all made of awareness. And then there are other types of meditation that can be very helpful, like more constructive meditations, where we tune into actually creating a sense of loving kindness or of compassion or love or joy. Um, and then ultimately, underlying all of those three different types of meditations, the calming, um, quietening, peace, calm, abiding meditations, the deconstructive, and then the constructive, underlying all of them is this kind of open presence, open awareness, um, and ultimately a non-dual open awareness, simply abiding as being. So meditation, as I said, big picture is just familiarization with the nature of our minds. But then there are all these kind of various wonderful techniques to explore that, and then ultimately just simply abide as non-dual awareness.
And the idea is by seeing the nature of mind, in other words, how we construct reality, how we construct our experience, when that's seen through and understood, there can be less suffering because we can stop constructing narratives or an experience of what's happening that's interpreted as bad. Just interrupt me if I'm
Yeah, yeah.
misrepresenting or yeah, and also we can construct more beautiful experiences. So when you say construction, do you mean things like more gratitude or more love or more joy or more generosity? That these are things that we're not born with and you're kind of just stamped genetically with a certain disposition, but they're malleable to some extent and you can start to.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, let's take this slowly because this is very important. I would say the most important thing is this deconstruction process. Um, but the key message to get in this deconstruction process, to understand how things are made, is that everything that arises, all emotions, all sensations, all objects, all phenomena of our experience are mental constructions. And so they are not what we take them to be. They're not real in themselves. So the naive perspective is that when I see this bottle, I'm actually literally looking out of the windows of my eyes, somehow standing somewhere behind my eyes and seeing something real. But in fact, that's not this naive uh, Cartesian dualism um, is just a kind of an illusion. What we come to see is that I'm not really seeing the bottle as it is, or the tree as it really is out there. I'm seeing an internal representation or construction of a tree, and that everything is this kind of internal construction representation, including um, this avatar, this so-called subject, this self. is also a phenomenal self-model. It's an internal model within our experience, within our minds. And then the most important thing to recognize in this is that it's not the thing in itself. It's, we naively take the tree to be the tree as it really is, and that we are this real existent being. And yet, of course, all of it is a construction. So we take things to be reified, that they're really existently, they exist from their own side. But in fact, what we recognize in meditation is that they are, and this is a technical Buddhist term, that they are empty. And they are, what that means is that they're empty of inherent existence from their own side, so that they are de-reified. In other words, there's a recognition that the tree is a mental construction, and so is the self. And so everything that's arising is simply a mental construction. And so it's not the thing in itself, if you can, even if there even was a thing in itself, but they are something else. It's not nothing. There is an experience happening. So this is very important. Emptiness does not mean nothing. Emptiness means that it is not reified. It's not real. And when we come to see that it's not real, the gripping relaxes. And so, imagine a game of Monopoly. We're playing this game of Monopoly, and oh my God, I really have to win. It's like a matter of life and death. It's really, really, really important. I'm just totally caught up in this story, and this is the real story. And this is really what's happening. No, relax. It's just a game. It's like a mental construction. And when you look at it from that perspective, oh yeah, I can enjoy the process of winning, but this is just a game that's happening. And so it's a little bit like that. Everything is arising. This is not nihilism, but it's seen as this mental construction which allows for there to be less gripping. Now, one of the most important parts of that, in fact, you could almost forget about this deeper spiritual stuff. And if you really want to relax out of suffering, it is the mental proliferation that this can really help. So, say something happens, like someone says something to me, right? And I take it to be really real, or something happens to me and I take it to be really real. Now, that's some phenomena that's arising, but most of the suffering that happens is the mental proliferation, the thoughts that happen on top. Why did this happen to me? This is always going wrong. The world's a shitty place. Like, everything is like a pain in the neck, and I'm a useless person. And all of these thoughts start happening, right? And we take them to be really, really real. We get totally lost in our own drama and forget that it's a mental construction, and are completely unconscious of the fact that these things are pulling us, and we take it to be absolutely like the most important thing. We're totally lost within that whole drama of mental proliferation. And so the beginning mindfulness is simply becoming aware of what is arising. And when that happens, there's a little bit of de-reification. We kind of recognize that, oh, look, this is what's arising. Oh, I've just become a little upset at what's happening. And when I recognize that, it means that I have the ability to also recognize some mental proliferation that's happening. And when I don't take it so literally, so really, um, that whole process calms down and can be seen through, and so grips less and is less suffering promoting.
And what it was a few months ago, I was at a gathering with some friends, and someone got out the game Go. You know the game Go?
Yeah,
Um, Amazing game. So simple in its setup, and apparently there's thousands, if not hundreds of thousands more potential moves than say in chess. It took several more years for computers to beat humans at Go than it did at chess, if I remember correctly. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. The point is, I was playing this game, I was enjoying learning. Um, I knew that I was a beginner. I just started learning, and I started playing. Um, I remember against a friend who perhaps sometimes we have a competitive streak between us. And I'm a meditator, and I know that it's just a game, and I have insights at times where I really get what you're saying, that everything arising is somehow constructed. But I could really notice how when I thought I might win, my heart would start to race a little bit. And when it looked like I'd made a mistake, I'd notice my body sweating a little bit. And I would tell myself, look, it's just a game. It doesn't really matter if you win or if you lose. But my physiology was really invested somehow, no matter how much I would tell myself, because sometimes it was suffering. It didn't feel nice to be sweating and riled up about winning or losing this game. Maybe you could take that example as because it's clear that just knowing this, because if you'd
yeah,
have said, "Hey, Amir, you know it's just a game," I'd be like, "Yeah," and you know that if you win, you don't get anything, and if you lose, you don't really lose anything except this mental construction. It's very obviously a mental construction. There's no inherent significance about where the stones are. If another animal was to come into the room and they wouldn't see that someone was winning or losing, there was nothing inherent in it, and yet it had the capacity to create some suffering in me. So maybe you could take that as an
yeah.
example of how,
Okay, good, good.
yeah,
That's actually a really good example, and I'm so glad you brought up physiology and reactions, because that physiological response and reactions are not yet suffering. So this is very important. And you might sort of say, I don't want to feel this kind of um, pounding heart rate or physiological kind of gripping. But those are arising within your body. Um, they are phenomena that are arising. Um, the thing that really starts the suffering journey is our reactions and responses to those physiological reactions. And in fact, you know, um, we don't want to necessarily stop the physiological reactions. It is really nice and enjoyable to play a game and actually enjoy it. In fact, when you realize that the responses, the reactions to that physiology um, are also mental constructions, um, then you realize you have some room to respond differently. So let's just go into kind of a modern interpretation of how emotions really work. Um, so in the kind of modern neuroscience of emotion, we have physiological responses, um, and then we have interpretations, mental interpretations of those physiological responses. And it is the combination of the two of what the physiology is, what I'm feeling at the kind of raw, visceral, what's called interoceptive awareness, and my cognitive interpretation of those that causes the emotion. So a famous example was um, sort of giving people a shot of adrenaline and then giving them two interpretations of why they feel this these particular physiological responses. One is that they're really nervous and worried about something, and another is that they're excited. And if we prime them in different ways, actually the emotion that was felt was different. So you got the same shot of adrenaline, but if you interpret it as excitement, you would be like, oh, I got so much energy. I'm really excited about playing this game. Um, versus somebody else like, oh, really stressed. I'm so anxious. This is like deeply uncomfortable, and I don't want to feel like this. Okay, but it was the same shot of adrenaline. Very interesting. So that's a kind of very instructive of how we construct our emotions, and ultimately, um, even the interpretations of the emotions themselves. Like, I don't want to feel stressed or anxious. Actually, feeling the physiology, the physiological reactions of the stress response is totally okay. Like, you can actually tune into it. Um, uh, but if you say, I don't want to feel like this, that's the beginning of suffering. So playing the game, yeah, it's totally cool to play the game and feel excited and yeah, this is it. Like, I'm really getting into it and enjoying the game and and feeling excited and having physiological response. But here's the interesting thing. Now I've said all that. If one has a kind of a lighter, enjoying the experience of it, what happens is that there is less mental proliferation. There's a kind of a Pali word for that in the Buddhist literature called papancha or prapancha in Sanskrit, which is this kind of feedback, like, if you're unhappy, like, I don't want to feel like all stressed about this response, and like, why am I getting so het up about this game, and I'm not really enjoying, you know. So this mental proliferation actually tends to increase the stress response. It increases the physiology. There's kind of feedback loops. And so what happens is that when we take it more lightly, there is less of this kind of feedback. So the physiology is there, but it may not get activated as much. If we hold it lightly, you might enjoy the feeling of excitement, but it doesn't tend to overwhelm. It doesn't tend to get fed back because one of the things about feeling a stress response is when I say I really don't want to feel a stress response, that actually is also stressful and causes this increase. And so it's a complicated process. Now, as time goes on, as you become more and more in the habit of just relaxing and enjoying what's going on, it may be that the patterns and habits of the body and the physiological response start to what's called go through extinction therapy, extinguish these patterns that and habits. And so unhelpful patterns, inverted commas, because of course it's just an interpretation was unhelpful, but unhelpful patterns can start to dissolve. For example, I might have a phobia of, spiders, and when I tend to relax and, it's like, okay, and, have some spider exposure, which is very far away, and I'm still relaxed. And then that emotional response and mental proliferation doesn't happen so much. And so I get less physiological response. And so I slowly extinguish the pattern of getting totally freaked out by spiders.
Mm.
And this can happen. This happens in modern cognitive behavioral therapy, and this is essentially the same message that was there in meditation.
And just going back to that experiment, I'm interested, do you, maybe you don't know, but do you know if the people experiencing stress, unpleasant stress, who are primed for that, if that was accompanied or from a third person perspective, different chemicals were showing up versus the group that experienced it as excitement.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember the exact details, but I'm pretty sure that there wasn't that kind of level of ongoing monitoring in the blood chemistry.
Uh-huh.
So that would be an interesting one to do right now, which is to show that in fact, as you resisted that adrenaline shot, you would actually increase endogenous, stress response, adrenaline, noradrenaline, sympathetic uh, response, sympathetic autonomic nervous response. And I think you're absolutely right about that. This is really what I was saying. So that is right because of this feedback. I think I'm pretty sure. But in that experiment, this was done many years ago. So
And sometimes I've had the lens that science is validating what previous generations had intuited or observed. There's this great example that I love. Apparently, so this quite big now, binaural beats. I don't quite understand the technology, but it's something to do with you play one rhythm in one ear, one rhythm in the other. There's some kind of the way the brain interprets them both creates a third rhythm, and that entrains certain brainwave rhythms in the mind that are associated with different states of consciousness. There's lots of research going on to it, and people use it for studying, for relaxation, for sleep. You can kind of decide which state of consciousness you want to move towards and use particular rhythms or beats to achieve that. I haven't, most of the stories I tell, I haven't checked for myself, but what someone said is that well-made Tibetan bells, uh, when these were analyzed for the rhythm, the kind of sonic rhythms that they were creating, if you ding them and then place them on either side of the head, they're creating these binaural beats. And these are ancient
yeah,
bells. So obviously they didn't have computers that were looking at the waves that the different rhythms were creating. They either had some kind of intuition around it or trial and error. Anyway, this is a long way of asking the question, which is again and again, we're seeing different ways in which science validates what previous traditions had already intuited or discovered by other means. Um, but my sense from talking to you is that potentially science has more than a role in just validating. Maybe it can add something here to the story, um, that it can enhance what these ancient traditions can offer.
yeah,
Is that right?
yeah. I actually agree with this perspective a lot. I think that great contemplative traditions in the past um, used deep mindfulness skills to empirically figure out um, what was going on in the body and tuned into things that were really working and tuned into how the mind must be working. Um, uh, and when we now look back at some of these, we find that they're very prescient. Um, I mean, just to give you an idea, like, you've got Plato and Aristotle who intuited that the mind is not unified, that there are different competing modules, if you like, in the mind. I mean, Plato had this tripartite soul. You had this reasoning part and this emotion part and this appetitive part. Um, Aristotle again, had this kind of very sophisticated story of how reason and emotions pull in different directions. That actually what we want to do in a well-functioning human mind is somehow learn how to have harmony in the mind, in the soul, rather than a civil war. And so, and what we find now, in the last 50 years is, oh, look, it does look like in the fear response, you've got the amygdala mediating some sort of primitive fear circuit, and the prefrontal cortex having prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus modulating with the amygdala in some way, and there being two-way feedback, and we see exactly this kind of behavior now that we understand. Now that we start to see it in simple cases of primitive emotion, we see exactly that kind of civil war in the mind that that the ancient Greeks talked about. So I think that a lot of these traditions actually absolutely tuned into something that was there. I mean, another one is the amazing science around breath. So you've got this very sophisticated technology in some of the contemplative traditions to do with breath works like pranayama, various breathing techniques which influence the body's physiology. We can increase the arousal by using breath. We can relax the body and the physiology using breath. If you exhale longer than you inhale, we now know that you're effectively influencing the balance of the sympathetic nervous system to the parasympathetic. In fact, even alternate nostril breathing, we see that breathing through the left increases the parasympathetic nervous system, and then the right is sympathetic. And so by doing alternate nostril breathing, somehow you are activating each one in a kind of, sort of sequential way. And it seems like, it's a little bit like when if you want to relax the body, if you've got a rusty handle, a door handle that's totally rusty, you wouldn't just try to pull it down. What you do is wiggle it. And so it kind of gets rid of the rust, and then you're able to kind of operate it more smoothly. Well, it looks like alternate nostril breathing is something like that, And we even understand how this is happening, that through the vagus nerve, and influencing the breathing, changing the heart rate patterns and heart rate variability, and changing that. So I think that, and these things were discovered even before there was an even idea of that there's this autonomic nervous system. But in fact, think about how prescient these ideas were. I mean, in the Indian traditions, in the kind of Kundalini Indian traditions, you have this left channel and the right channel in the so-called energy body. Don't know what an energy body is, but now when we look back and we say, well, that's kind of, when they were talking about these two channels, it kind of seems to be somehow related to what's going on in the autonomic nervous system with the sympathetic and parasympathetic. And then they talked about the central channel, which is this Shushumna Nadi, this central channel. And somehow when the two side channels were balanced, you got this energy flow in the central channel. Now, what could that mean? Well, I mean, who knows? But one of the things is that in the two branches of the autonomic nervous system inhibit each other. So the sympathetic branch inhibits parasympathetic activation and vice versa. And so normally what you have in normal physiology is you would have be say 80% sympathetic, kind of stress response and 20% relaxation response, or vice versa, very relaxed and not very stressed. Now, perhaps some of these ancient technologies around breath and around yoga, by manipulating the system in a particular way, might have actually been able to reduce the inhibition so that you got this very interesting physiological response, not a normal one, where you actually get an activation of both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. And so what you end up with is a very interesting physiological state, which is something like relaxed alertness. So very aroused, bright, alert, crystal clear attention in a relaxed way. So that's exactly the kind of state that you want for meditation, which is a relaxed alertness. Yeah, so I think that there is an enormous empirically derived wisdom that we will slowly come to see. Now, we have to be careful that we are cherry picking a lot of stuff from the traditions. And so what we might find is that when you really look at this and look at all the things that were said, many of them we might not really be able to understand how they make any sense in the modern world picture, but there'll be some that will make sense. And so I think it's perfectly reasonable that we do cherry pick. And it's one of the reasons why I think that we shouldn't be too reverential to these traditions. I think we should actually stand outside the traditions, beg, borrow, and steal from all the traditions, not be too precious about it, and apply science, because we are now creating our own tradition. So yeah, that's my take.
The famous examples with Aristotle are that men and women have different number of teeth, which is I don't know if these are true, but quite easy to just open a few mouths and count, or if you were to drop a large stone and a small stone off a mountain, I think the intuition is that they would arrive at the same time, or no, one would be slower.
The heavier one would fall faster was Aristotle's intuition. Of course, Galileo uh, showed and actually reasoned that, in fact, rather intuitively, the heavier and light stone fall at the same rate.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So there are many, many things that the ancients got wrong, of course.
And you're saying that in all traditions. So that speaks to, I guess, your metaphysical or ontological, or your viewpoint or your view on reality, that you don't perceive these traditions as being revealed from a higher power. They were almost scientifically intuited or observed by careful contemplation of one's inner state, and it was possible to arrive at conclusions that were wrong. And that is something that modern science as a tool can help. What's it called when I'm losing the word, sort through, sort through.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
Do you have an example of something that science brought to your meditation or spiritual or contemplative practice that doesn't necessarily come out from the ancient traditions in a clear way?
well, so we have to also be careful that that we don't sort of say that science is we don't fall into the trap of scientism, which is like that science is the revealed truth. Because, of course, science is just one way of us making sense of the world. And these traditions are also another way of us trying to make sense of the world. Um, and uh, and so, in one sense, science and what the ancient contemplative traditions were we're figuring out are on a level playing field, actually. I think that they're on a level playing field. Um, it's just that science is a really, really good, very impressive project, actually. It's just that we mustn't put it on a metaphysical pedestal. So yeah, it's like I mean, science also doesn't have doesn't reveal reality as it is. We are using science to explain our phenomenal world. The phenomenal world means the world as we experience it. Now, um, where, but it doesn't reveal the so-called noumenal world, which is the world as it really, really is. Even if that were to make sense, I'm not saying that that even makes sense, but even if that were to make sense, science is not doing that. It's giving us models to interpret our sensory data, our evidence, our experience. So electrons are just models that we use. They're very good models. And they're so good that, in fact, some of these models are extraordinary. We can measure the anomalous magnetic moment of an electron to 13 decimal places. I mean, it's astonishing what that means. 13 decimal places. That's like, as Richard Feynman put it, knowing the distance between New York and LA to within the width of a human hair. I mean, it's astonishing how good some of these models are, but they're not telling you reality itself. They're telling you how to model the sensory data coming from our instruments. And so, now why is that helpful? Well, it is helpful because it's helpful in a useful way. If I can really model the world, then I can interpret how it's going to react. And first of all, I can find useful things like finding new food sources, but I can also create, model how a rocket should be, should move to get to the moon, right? And so it can be very useful, and also how to create an iPhone. So these things are pragmatically useful. Science is a good story of how the world works. Now, I know this is very provocative to call science a story. You can call it a narrative. It's a good narrative. Now, why do I say it's a good narrative? It's a good narrative because it's a narrative, it's a story that allows us to predict our sensory data very well. So it's got empirical value. It's a narrative that is economical and parsimonious. So scientific stories are much simpler than other stories like angels dancing on pinheads to figure out how, um, balls fall, for example. It's much, much more elegant and simpler and from an information theoretic perspective, compact and parsimonious than other stories. Science is a good story. Scientific stories are good stories because they cohere with a lot of other stories. So we find that when stories or belief structures cohere with many other story structures, they're more likely to be true. If I just have, a few story structures that kind of don't mesh with the rest of what I know about the world, like, for example, witches float on water, and they don't sink. And these are story structures which were there, and hundreds of years ago, and they weren't very good story structures. They kind of didn't cohere with a lot of other story structures, right? So they're not story structures that have empirical value, Story structures that are economical and parsimonious are good story structures. Story structures that are coherent with our other story structures that allow us to survive. So scientific story structures are very good because they allow us to create, I don't know, techniques to allow us to grow more food, to create antibiotics and save people's lives, So these are good stories. Um, and uh, and we should uh, be satisfied with that. Now, you can go the extra mile to say, no, they are really describing. You can have a metaphysical view that reality is what our best science says it is. Well, there's several problems with that. First of all, we don't, science is constantly improving, and so we don't have a final science yet. Second of all, when you really drill down into what the science is saying, like quantum physics, you end up with a bunch of mathematics with no substance. So it might not even tell you what reality is. It's just models. Nevertheless, that is a particular metaphysical view called physicalism, which is one form of physicalism, which is no, reality is what our science or our final science will say it is. Um, and that's a respectable viewpoint, but we should understand that we are then moving from science to metaphysics, and that's perfectly fine.
The examples you gave were things like iPhones, putting someone on the moon, antibiotics, which would traditionally, I think, in contemplative traditions, be seen as causes and conditions, not necessarily part of the spiritual path or the contemplative path. Are there ways in which, because I know you've done a lot of science on perception, on computational neuroscience, collaborations with very well-known and respected researchers in those areas. Are there ways in which this research or their findings have supported your meditation practice?
Right, great. Well, first of all, just to say that making iPhones and going to the moon is also a part of our spiritual reality, a part of our reality. Um, it's like magnificent that we can do that. So I don't
You don't
yeah
draw a hard line
yeah, I
between.
mean, in fact, how manifestation arises um, is what science is trying to describe.
Mm.
So I see science as, from that perspective, they're very, very much together. But very good point about, the science of our experience.
Yeah, I guess if it's okay, yeah, maybe I'll just find a better way of asking the question, which is the perception some people in some spiritual traditions might have of like, great, your science is very impressive. Maybe you'll get to the moon, maybe one day you'll get to Mars, but you'll probably be equally unhappy on Mars.
Yeah,
It's not
yeah,
getting to the root cause of your suffering. And if that's what you're interested in, you can put down your science. But what I hear from you, I think, is even if you took that perspective, the science might help your contemplative path. I don't know that
yeah,
you've never
yeah.
said it in those exact words, but just inviting you to.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. And I also recognize that I didn't fully answer the question that you said, how has science been helpful in my own spiritual journey? I
Well,
mean,
you did in the sense that you don't see this clear division that some people do of it's all arising in mind. In a way, science is only what I understood from what you said before is science is an investigation of our dashboard of reality because that's
yes.
all we have access to. So I can see how from your position, you're not making this hard line between the two things. But I was just trying to drill down on again the root cause of suffering as a
Yeah.
potential, yeah.
So let's look at that. I mean, let's look at this very wonderful new way, new story that's now available, which coheres with our best science and actually which coheres with our contemplative experience and understanding. And that is, we start to look at the science of perception, the science of consciousness, of experience, how the brain constructs our experience. Now, this is very interesting. So you know, I mean, we can look at this from a very first principles perspective, which is, okay, so from a scientific point of view, we're sitting here and we receive sensory data from all our sense faculties. For example, I'm looking out and I'm seeing a tree. And how does that sensory data result in the experience that I'm having of a tree? And this question has been there in neuroscience for many years in the visual perception in vision science, and until about I'd say about 20 or 30 years ago, most scientists would have said, well, the way it works is we get the sensory data and we process it through our neural networks until we figure out what's going on, that we're looking at a tree. But rather astonishingly, there has been an absolute reversal of that perspective in the last 20 years. In fact, that picture is entirely upside down. Our brains cannot make sense of its sensory data from purely first principles perspective in that feed-forward way. Neither do neural networks and artificial neural networks with AI. Both of them, there simply is, it's just ambiguous what our data is. If you could actually see what's coming through your eyes, the sensory data, it's extremely messy. I mean, just to give you an idea, I mean, our retinas have this central patch, the macula, the fovea, which is the only part that can really see accurately and in color. And that's less than 2% of our visual field. So if you put up your finger and look at your thumbnail, that's all you can see in color and clarity. And yet you look around at the room that you're in or at the scene, and you see this perfect room as if it's really, really there, in color and in cartoonish definitions with straight lines and it's just appearing in front of you, right? We could absolutely not be seeing that through our eyes. And this is a real shocker for people to say, oh, I'm actually, like, this is not what I'm seeing. What you are seeing is your brain's best guess. It's a kind of an internal construction, an internal hallucination. It's your brain's best guess at what's going on. Now, this internal simulation, this internal hallucination, that would be problematic if we're just hallucinating our experience, because we probably wouldn't survive very long. What this internal model does is it actually minimizes. So you've got this internal output, and then I look over there and I see some data. And then what the model does is it says, oh, there's a there's a discrepancy, there's a prediction error between what's actually coming through my eyes and the output of this internal simulation, this kind of, what's going on in my hallucination. My hallucination is not quite conforming. There's a prediction error between the sensory data and my internal simulation. And what the brain does is it adjusts the parameters and dials and knobs of the internal hallucination, of the internal model, so that we minimize to as much as possible the prediction error between the sensory data and what I think is going on. So the brain we are living inside our own internally generated reality model, or world model, sometimes it's called, what's called a generative phenomenal world model. We're living inside, but that's what we experience. And this internal generative phenomenal world model is parameterized, is adjusted so that it minimizes the deviation to the sensory data. So we never actually see the sensory data. It's just used to calibrate our internal model. And in fact, the weird thing is that one of our current best algorithmic models of what's going on in the brain, something called predictive processing, hypothesizes that the sensory data that we get, for example, through our eyes, it doesn't actually go up through the brain hierarchy. The only thing that goes up is the prediction errors. What's happening is that the brain is generating our experience, our world model, our generative world model, generative phenomenal world model. And the only thing that goes up the hierarchy of the brain is the prediction errors. To say, hey, you got that bit slightly wrong. Can you kind of recalibrate it here? So we are in fact living within our own internal phenomenal generative world model. And the sense of self is another part of that internal phenomenal generative world model. Sometimes it's called a phenomenal self model. And there are different aspects of the self model. There's a kind of body map, there's a narrative self, there's a kind of introspective self, so I can feel my internal body sensations. And it's kind of, there's a perspectival self that I'm here and the tree is over there. And there's a whole slew of things that go into building a phenomenal self model. So this is really strange. This phenomenal self model is arising within a generative world model, which is all arising within our awareness. Actually, not all of the phenomenal generative world model, we may not be conscious of everything in our phenomenal generative world model. There are parts of the unconscious that don't rise up. So that's a separate discussion on consciousness, which we can get to later. Don't want to muddy it just now. But the point is that there is this massive error, of naive realism. We think we're looking at the world. This person is looking out at the world, but in fact, this representation, this world, this phenomenal self, and the world is all arising within our awareness. That's a huge, colossal, crazy error of naive realism. And we can wake up within this world model and recognize that it's all made of awareness, and recognize that the self is this buzzing, ever flowing um, constellation of sensations and ideas and thoughts and um, and then what do you do from there? So just to stop. So this is a very interesting uh, scientific story based on our best ideas of computational neuroscience, of what must be going on algorithmically in the brain for us to experience. And shockingly, it ends up with this core nugget of truth, which is literally the awakening of the awakened state of contemplative traditions. It actually points to exactly this deep wisdom that's coming out of the contemplative traditions to say, reality is not what you think it is. This is kind of an illusion. And it is a constructed illusion. And that's what's, kind of amazing to see that the core idea of contemplative awakening traditions is exactly where we get to with this view from computational neurophenomenology.
There's a couple of things I'd love to go back over with what you said. And can you draw out even more? Not that there'd be anything wrong if science is merely validating, because as you said, there's lots that might have come out of these ancient traditions that turns out was wrong. And if science can validate some of it, or corroborate some of it and give us confidence, that part was spot on. That part was very accurate. The part about men and women having different number of teeth, actually, that turns out that wasn't true. And equally, there might be some other things in meditative traditions, especially important, I guess, when they seem to contradict each other, when one Buddhist school is claiming one thing and another Buddhist school is claiming something else. And if neuroscience can help us discover, well, actually, emotions are constructed like this. This is what appears to validate. So I don't want to diminish that power, but in what you've said, is there also something that science adds that wasn't known or that wasn't obvious um, in in the traditional meditation traditions?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I would say that I just want to say that the contemplative traditions really have evolved quite impressively. Some of the technology around um, awakening and meditative techniques that were developed um, over the last few thousand years start to get really good. I mean, the meditation techniques that were there 3,000 years ago were good, but this is one of the sort of many traditions sort of say, "Oh no, we'd figured it all out 3,000 years ago." But actually, when you really look at the philosophical development and the way that the techniques developed, no. The meditation techniques got really a lot better um, from 3,000 years ago to the time of Buddha, to the time of Nagarjuna, 200 AD, to the Tantric revolution, and they start really, getting amazingly powerful with Advaita Vedanta and other non-dual traditions at around 1000 AD, 1000 CE. And, and then they start to develop, get like um, incredibly fine-grained, through, for example, the Tibetan traditions and things like that. So I think that first of all, I want to say that empirical wisdom is amazing. So we have to be humble about, that science can like figure out everything. Nevertheless, one of the powerful things that this scientific story can do is that it can act as a new pointing out instruction, new narrative structure, which is to some extent more elegant and more parsimonious than some of the traditional structures. Um, for example, um, I, I'll give you a good example. So there are over the course of millennia, contemplative traditions have figured out that as you start working with the mind, you start to deconstruct and your phenomenology, and you tend to deconstruct in a kind of a systematic way. So you first discover that, oh gosh, I am not my thoughts. These thoughts are just rising. And then you start to discover that what I take this body to be is kind of a construction. It's not really solid. Like I see I have this solid arm and body, but in meditation, you see that this body map is itself a construction. And when you really tune into it, not tuning into the concept of an arm, but tune into the body sensations that constitute the arm, you realize that that is this cloud of sensations that is actually not solid and is effervescent. And your body that you took to be real starts to dissolve. And then as you deconstruct further, you realize that other phenomena that you took to be real start to dissolve in a kind of predetermined manner. And then way down the stack, you start to dissolve even the concept of space and then ultimately of time. Now,
When you say dissolve, do you mean during the meditation it no longer appears?
right, exactly.
Is that what
So
you mean? Yeah.
yes, the experience of having a solid body, um, the the solidity of the body in your experience, your body is experienced as dissolving into a cloud of of sensations, for example. So this is still
Mhm.
in experience.
So the subjective sense of owning thoughts, of having or being thoughts, that starts to dissolve. Then
Right.
it's like the felt sense of the body being solid. So it's not that the body disappears, just the perception of it being a solid thing. It's more like a cloud.
Right.
Is that what you're?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now, the why I say this is because what we now understand is that through um, artificial neural networks and in the brain's cortical hierarchy, we now see how these structures are constructed one layer at a time. For example, in the visual field, we get sensory data, and then there's an initial construction at the first level in the primary visual cortex. There are um, little patch receptors which detect edges and corners and gradations, and then those are recombined into building up little objects, and then eventually you build up noses and eyes and ears, and then from there you build up the concept of a face, and then from there you build up even higher level concepts. So there's an abstraction hierarchy of construction that we can actually see. Um, we have various lines of evidence to show that there is this cortical hierarchy of abstraction. And the amazing thing is that this cortical hierarchy of construction actually when we look at it, when we've come to understand it in the last 50 years, we see that rather amazingly, it conforms to exactly the way that meditators hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago potentially, were describing deconstructing their phenomenology. So literally, they were going through the cortical hierarchy of abstraction and deconstructing it one layer at a time. Now, so learning more about the cortical abstraction hierarchy can actually start to be instructive in how to deconstruct our reality. We may be able to get better pointing out instructions, because what we will see is that, oh, look, you know, you've got in the cortical hierarchy of abstraction, you have, for example, at the first level, you have low-level somatosensory constructs, and then prosodic. That means this sort of the way that phonemes are built up, sound phonemes and things like that and then you will be able to get words and other phenomena, and then you get higher level things like faces and motion and movement and from it and emotions like disgust, and then from there you get kind of more intuitive things, even mathematics, and then you right at the top you get abstract concepts and language. So we might be able to fine-tune meditation instructions to actually go down there. And in fact, we may be able to actually fine-tune instructions, like if someone, you could take someone on a journey of deconstructing sound from understanding the words to just the actual sound of the words to just understand, just focusing on the phonemes, to understanding then just even the vibrations below the phonemes. And so, yeah, so I think that we will find ways in which the science ends up supporting better. When I say better instruction, I mean there's amazing instructions already. It's just that it's also not just that it might give us better instruction, but it might also allow us to understand what's going on from a view in what we're doing in meditation, and therefore allows the meditation to be itself more effective by having a conceptual view in which to place our experience. So we're not replacing our experience, our phenomenology, our deep meditative experience with a purely intellectual understanding, but by having an intellectual understanding, it allows us to actually clarify our phenomenology, and that itself can be very, very useful. In my own journey, I've found it extremely helpful in clarifying what happens in meditation, and I think it can, it can help the progress of meditation. There are many traditions that there are many it's possible to be stuck for decades in a meditative journey. People can just be stuck in and not be able to make progress with particular meditation instructions. And what we might end up doing is finding ways of making the whole meditation journey more effective.
So what I'm hearing is, correct me if I'm wrong, that what this science of perception, the theories of predictive processing, computational neuroscience, looking also at how we can emulate perception with artificial neural networks. What that can contribute to this world is, just to reiterate one more time, it can help to validate some practices and also sometimes maybe to show how some practices um, aren't as effective or don't match up with third person scientific investigation as much as we might hope. Um, it can also add potentially a lot of nuance. So you were talking about how sound gets constructed in just raw sound data, then phonemes, and then words and sentences and abstract meanings, and to really be able to understand how the little steps between each one could add nuance in someone's meditative journey of noticing each step, potentially with even finer granulation than is in some of the ancient traditions. But also, perhaps what I'm hearing, most important is that it translates it and couches it in modern secular language. That if someone comes and they have some natural skepticism or wariness about traditional accounts of how meditation works, which very often interwoven in these are things that are harder for most modern Westerners to accept around reincarnation or spirits or deities or quite uh, fantastical accounts of powers, which maybe one day science will validate in some way or another. But for now, it's probably hard for most Westerners to accept that certain accounts of out-of-body experiences or um, what's it called when you can read someone's mind? Uh,
Telepathy.
Telepathy and or telekinesis, things like this. So we can put all those to one side, but what we can take out and put in modern neuroscientific language is how perception is constructed. And then using meditation, we can bring more to the forefront of our awareness the very ways in which our perception is being constructed. So it's almost like a map on the map.
Right. Exactly. And so I think it's a very nice point that you've made about a lot of the benefit being having a language that makes some of the um, deep insights, contemplative insights, less out there, less woo-woo. The issue is that someone looking at, who wants to sort of say, yeah, I'd like to learn meditation, but I don't know all of this stuff. I mean, what is this stuff around enlightenment and all that? That's just mumbo jumbo. But the interesting thing is that um, if if there's a way of conceptualizing, having a view, the notion of awakening within a contemporary scientific perspective to show that, in fact, awakening is somehow getting a resolving our perception away from an illusion or a mistake, a fundamental mistake that of naive realism. That's kind of important. What it says is that someone coming to meditation can say, right, okay. So there are people out there who claim that there's a there, that there's a there. And this scientific discourse basically shows the way to say that there seems to be a there. Okay, so maybe there's something to this. Maybe I should start to meditate.
So how, let's say I have a friend, let's pretend I'm relatively open-minded but gently skeptical neuroscientist with no spiritual background. And I respect you as a scientist and I hear this word awakening, which previously I would have thought, well, that just sounds like mumbo jumbo fantasy. How would you translate what awakening means in neuroscience speak. What?
Yeah, so um, I would say that it is essentially, I've been describing it already, but I would again put it in the same way to say that um, we are our brain is constructing a phenomenal generative world model to act and survive in the world. And that phenomenal generative world model includes a phenomenal self model. And all objects in that world model, including the self model, are taken to be real, um, uh, naively real. And that is very, very helpful for survival because it means that I know how to run away from the tiger. If the tiger is over there and I'm over here, then I should run over there. And, it allows me to navigate my world extremely well. But we're kind of totally uh, don't realize that this is all happening within our own model. So a typical way of talking about that is when I look out of a window, I've got a window in front of me, and I'm looking out of the window and I'm looking at the tree, and I see this tree. It's a lovely, lovely tree. And I don't realize that I'm looking through a piece of glass. And the glass, the window is entirely transparent to me. So I see this tree and the mental machinery of generating it, the constructed nature, the fact that it's just an illusion within my own mind, is entirely transparent to me. Now, that can suddenly become opaque. The window can suddenly become awake. I can look at the window and recognize, oh, there's a window there. Now, the window is representing the fact that it's a mental construction. Now, in other words, when I opacify the processes of the mind, make them opaque, and recognize that all of this is arising within my awareness, suddenly the transparency disappears. And with that transparency disappears, the illusion of naive realism disappears. And then we've woken up to the nature of mind. Now, just for meditators out there, I just want to, you know, say that the word transparency and opacity here is very weird because, in a way, one of the funny things that happens when we make these processes opaque, phenomenologically, the world looks a little bit more translucent or transparent, which is unfortunate because it's kind of the opposite of what opaque is like. And oddly enough, when these processes are transparent to us, the world looks more solid or opaque. So yeah, it's a little confusing there. But this is the idea that we want awakening is essentially global opacity. And when everything is seen as this mental construction, the world is recognized that it's kind of like a dream. But it's a dream that we can become lucid within. And then we're in the ballpark of awakening. When we become lucid within our own dream, recognize that this is a mental construction and we can become lucid. We don't wake up out of the dream, we wake up within the dream. We wake up within the phenomenal generative world model. Now, yeah.
And so the benefit is I was taking everything I'm experiencing to be solid and real. I learned this neuroscience, which shows how mostly it's a construction with some error. It doesn't it maps onto reality or whatever's out there, if anything's out there, at some level, but it's mostly a construction of the mind. And when I not only know this to be true, but I'm experiencing it as true, that's the awakening. And the certain clinging, which causes suffering, this deep desire for things to go a certain way and not go another way, that can relax on awakening to the fact, hey, 98% of what you're experiencing anyway is a construction of your own mind. Am I in
Yeah,
the ballpark?
exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, this there's sort of one more piece, which is what you were sort of grappling with, is somehow this constructed reality somehow sort of conforms to what's out there. So there's a lovely Buddhist term called dependent co-arising, which is our experience is a dependent co-arising between the sensory data that we get, the world, and the way we look at it, the sort of the internal model that we bring to bear. And so the world as we experience is not disconnected from whatever's out there. The way I'd like to look at it is like it resonates with reality. But realities could be of a different sort. I mean, here's a good example. A flag that's waving in the wind, okay? Imagine a flag that's waving in the wind. And the flag thinks that its motion is the wind, but the wind is some air. The flag's never even heard of air or wind, but all the flag knows is how it's moving. So the reality for flag is some sort of movement of fabric, but the reality of the world is wind, completely different type of thing. It's like, so this is just an analogy, but there is something wonderful about the flag. It's resonating with the world. It's responding to the world. Now, where this isn't a full analogy is that the flag is kind of not bringing to bear its own view of the world, or in a way, the view of the world for a flag is sort of hardwired into the physicality of the fabric. But our fabric is rather more malleable than the flag's fabric, and we can view the world in different ways. We can see it with certain assumptions or beliefs that we're bringing to bear in our models. These beliefs or priors that we're bringing to bear in our models allows us to interpret the sensory data in different ways, to construct it in different ways. There are many ways in which we can construct the world from our sensory data.
This is really important because I think for me at least, concrete examples are really useful. So one that's popping into my mind is if someone was complaining, "Oh, I really don't like this song. It's too loud." Well, the song isn't inherently loud or quiet. It's coming through your iPhone, your computer, your stereo. There's a knob there. You can turn it up and you can turn it down. If it's too loud for you, that you can modulate your experience. Now, there is something coming at you from out there that you're not creating, but your interface with it, let's say it's a radio. This is a very simple example of just volume. Your interface with the signal that's coming in, which is the radio signal, comes through your radio, and you can turn that up and you can turn it down. That's on your side, the volume. Or let's say this picture right now, I'm seeing a picture of you, and there's a whole bunch of knobs on my computer. I don't know where to find them, but there's settings that can increase the contrast. I can increase the grayscale. I can make you bright and pop, or I can make it all a bit subdued and fuzzy. So it's not that you're saying there's nothing out there coming in. But you've got quite a wide scope inside how you're interpreting and how you're modulating the experience to modify it in ways that are much more pleasant And even deeper than that, knowing that you're responsible. That's too strong a word, but you know what I mean.
Yeah,
You're
yeah.
participating in the construction of it can release a lot of the clinging around how things are showing up.
Exactly. And we haven't yet talked about action into the world because there you said you can actually turn the volume down, which is, a nice action to do. You could also do the action of like relaxing and enjoying the thumping music and changing your attitude towards it. But I think this is exactly right, which is that, and I think this is deeply important. I mean, the example I sometimes give of this dependent co-arising, and this is the kind of a, not to get too technical about it, this is sort of a what I call a Bayesian dependent co-arising. We'll forget about the equations right now. But say the example I sometimes give is um, take a top level belief structure, top level prior of someone who's depressed. So someone who's depressed, the top level belief structure is, the model, one of the top level models that they have, a core assumption in the top level model is the world is a rubbish place and I'm a useless person and everything always goes wrong. And suppose I have that top level belief structure and I get some sensory data and I take that sensory data and I say, what's the probability of this data? What's the probability that the world is a rubbish place given the sensory data? And it turns out you can interpret the data. See, it's raining. Everything's always going wrong, and I'm useless. And like, oh, this is not how I want it. And like, I'm looking at see, I told you the glass is half full. Now, that you're literally painting your world, and all the data is validating that world view. And it's the important thing is that the what's called the posterior, the experience of coming together, the dependent co-arising, validates your assumption that the glass was half full. So you are strengthening your belief that the world is a terrible place and you're a useless person. And so that you get stuck in a cycle and perhaps spiral into more depression. On the other hand, if you were to have a belief structure that the world is amazing, it's kind of a miracle. There's just this sort of gift that's arising, miraculous. And you look at the world and you see, it's like, look at this, like there's plants growing out, there's an ecosystem, like there's some sort of Garden of Eden that we're living in. What the hell? Like, and I'm experiencing something amazing, and the universe has become conscious of itself. Holy cow. Wow. And then my experience validates my priors, the core beliefs. And so those priors become more ingrained. And then the world indeed becomes more and more beautiful and miraculous. So that's sort of like moving on from the deconstruction more to the reconstruction. These are beautiful ways of looking at the world in Rob Rabea's terms.
So, you're doing a talk in London. Well, that'll be online as well, and also a course. I'm just wondering, because I know you have another thing you have to do this afternoon, if we can just look a little bit at the overview of that talk and the course and just talk about why the structure for the course will go deeply into these subjects. I wonder if it's even worth um, sharing my screen. I don't know if I can do that.
Why don't you do that?
Um,
Because it'll remind me what's in the course.
yeah. Um, Yeah, so it's a 4-week course. We might find a way of doing it online as well. Um, but it's starting 10th of July in London. There'll first be a talk where you introduce the overall map of this whole thing, but you provided a quite incredible course structure, which I think gives an overview of your whole path and philosophy and many of the things we've been speaking to. So does that seem like an okay invitation to just um, look through this and uh, say why you've put it in this order and what these things mean to you? Obviously, at a very top level, because if you were to go through in detail, you'd be basically giving the course. Um,
Yeah, I'll say a few sentences on each in each one. So we split it into 4 weeks, and then the first week is how the brain constructs our reality, how the mind constructs the self and the experienced world, and how that actually works algorithmically in the brain, and how we have increasing amounts of evidence for this. And then how that ends up little bit like what we talked about today, how that ends up in understanding the nature of our awareness and the nature of awakening. So we will end up looking at the fundamental existential predicament that human beings find themselves in, and start to see the glimpse of how we can start to deconstruct that. In week two, we'll actually go into the deconstruction and look at how psychotechnologies for awakening, for example, meditation techniques, and other psychotechnologies like psychedelics and other techniques, um, can help us to deconstruct uh, our phenomenal generative world model, our reality, and actually awaken. And we'll go through the journey of that of those technologies through to awakening and becoming aware of emptiness and the nature of the self and non-dual awareness. And then, most importantly, as you say, finally, really being able to tune into um, how suffering is created, and therefore this radical reduction in suffering that can arise when there's more and more awakening in the system. And then the third week, we actually go into more of the constructed nature of how we can start to unwind our patterns, unhelpful patterns. And this is kind of the purification or liberation stage. And we go through memory reconsolidation and the dependent co-arising, Bayesian dependent co-arising of our reality, and explore this freedom that arises, this liberation that arises when we're no longer subject to the bondage of our unconscious programming. And then then we start to go into week four, which is how do we artfully reconstruct ourselves. What could this life be? And we start to look at ideas of human flourishing and the hero's journey and soul making, and start to also consider more metaphysical questions. How do we want to view the world? How do we think about deeper philosophical issues? So we'll get quite deep by the fourth week, and start to understand how all these different traditions um, are kind of many paths going up to the peak of the mountain. Or maybe there's not just one mountaintop. Maybe there's a whole mountain range that many paths are, going to. And so, we'll explore this kind of modern pluralist perspective of awakening, liberation, and reconstruction.
And one of the things that are more unique about your approach is that you really emphasize this idea of human flourishing. You said that a few times of it's not just a matter of going to a cave and being in this blissed out state without any interaction with the world, but you like to emphasize how this meditation and an ecology of practices can contribute to how we engage with the world. Is that right?
Yeah, you know, it took 13.8 billion years to end up producing you and me. And it really did take, I mean, it took all that time to produce all these carbon atoms and this whole evolutionary process on Earth. Given that the universe has gone to so much effort to produce you and me, these unique causes and conditions with historical, this particular set of causes, historical causes and conditions. I mean, why not make it beautiful? What can we do with this particular constellation of causes and conditions and information patterning? Yeah, let's flourish. I mean, you can do anything, but seems to me it will be like, I wonder how this instrument could really zing and vibrate with the universe beautifully.
Well, I'm really looking forward to it myself. Like I said, you have a talk initially where you'll go over the science of perception and how it relates to the various paths of meditation. And then there's this 4-week course. I'm really looking forward personally to both. I have known you for a while. I really admire how you so successfully straddle these two worlds. So I think there's a lot of scientists who are very interested in meditation and have dipped their toes in, and they're doing research kind of on the outside. And then there's people in the meditation world who really respect the science world and are loving that scientists are coming in and looking at what happens in meditation and various spiritual traditions. But there aren't that many people um, who are really who have really over decades developed expertise and competency in both worlds and can really form a bridge the way that you have. And I think that's one of the exciting things about the modern age and spirituality, these ancient traditions coming into the West, not just the West, obviously, but when I say the West, I mean the kind of Western culture and the value sets that they have. And it couldn't be happening at a more pressing time with how many new challenges are going to come to the foreground with AI and everything that's happening in the world. So yeah, just deep gratitude to you for putting this on. I think it's not been so publicly accessible up until now, this knowledge and wisdom that you've accrued.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. I mean, my view is that um, there are many, many stories that are helpful. Um, Maybe this one is another story that could be helpful for certain people. So yeah, I mean, I generally think that, let's be like unique flowers. Let 1,000 flowers bloom, see which ones you like, and make a beautiful bouquet of them. And this may be a flower that people might like.
And I like also that you don't ignore the philosophical questions. So you bring in philosophy and you don't ignore the material questions of, well, how can we live a good life? Like, how can it not just be a question of reframing what's going on out there or turning the knobs and the dials up and being less attached to what's happening, but also diving back in the game and, as you said, seeing what flowers we can have bloom, how we can be gardeners of our own lives. I don't know if that's a
Yeah,
useful metaphor, and
absolutely.
using the science and the beauty and the wisdom and the insights that science can bring. And I'm very excited to learn that as well. I've been intrigued for a long time, especially when you keep saying how in the past neuroscience would assume, let me see if I get this. In the past, neuroscience would have assumed, okay, I'm getting some light waves that, a certain speed, or I don't even know the correct right terms, amplitude or whatever, and then the brain translates that into blue, and then another light wave comes in, and the brain translates that into red or whatever, and a sound waves come in, and that gets translated into one sound or another. But what you're saying is, yes, those things are coming in, but the experience I'm having is mainly one that I've made up, modulated by when that data coming in doesn't match with what I've made up.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's much more top level down, and that's really open to uh, manipulation's the wrong word. To what would be a better word than
Well, I mean, reconstruction, um, and but that's so we can reconstruct it. But I think that before we reconstruct it, there are some big things that would happen, like awakening and no self or true self, and then we kind of can reconstruct it. I mean, the thing is,
okay? So
jumping.
first, it's waking up to the fact that I am constructing
Right.
it, and
Yeah.
then I can start to play with it.
I mean, the thing is that I would say that most people want to reconstruct their world without using the language. I think, but reconstructing it within the game is different from reconstructing it, recognizing first that it's a game.
Uh-huh. So first recognize, look at the rules and the ways that it's constructed, and
Yeah.
then
Yeah, it's a little bit like Neo in the Matrix. Like, first he had to wake up and then he can go around going back in the Matrix and flying around it.
hmm,
The thing is that other people are also trying to change their reality in the Matrix, but they don't realize it's a Matrix. And
mhm.
um, so yeah, it's a little bit like that.
Yeah, and I like that. And like, so he wasn't. He could Neo in the Matrix could see the full scope of what was malleable, but that wasn't infinite.
Yeah,
Like, he couldn't just turn the whole matrix off, but he could play within it with much in a much wider scope than everyone else who really took it just to be pure reality.
yeah.
Yeah,
He woke up within the Matrix to recognize, and I think that's it. I mean, there's some disanalogy there, but it's a good analogy.
great. Okay, well, thank you so much. Look forward to it.
So am I. Thanks.